Do you know Isaiah 53 pretty well?
Yeah. There's a few issues with Isaiah 53 that bother me. Both narratives of Christians and Jews don't jive well with, say, the flow of the text from Isaiah 40 through Isaiah 6. It seems like whoever wrote this is going from first person to third person. Like, I don't know who's talking sometimes. It seems like he's talking about Israel, so he's talking about some particular person. I think the idea of a servant is definitely discussed, like in Isaiah 42, he discusses a servant, but he also discusses Cyrus, the king, as being God's anointed. Whoever this person is, I think there's a political reasoning behind the idea of Mashiach, dating back to Chazal, or dating back to Jews under the Greeks and Romans. I think the idea of a Messiah was definitely not spiritual. I think it was political. And I think they used the text to justify it. That's my personal opinion. I don't think that it was also utopic spiritual thing going on. I think Jews had a clear knowledge of who Hashem was. They had a clear knowledge of their obligation to Hashem. I don't think they needed somebody to tell them who he was, the way we assume today. I think that idea now would be far more useful with someone to come out of the sky and tell us who God is, because it seems everybody has a monopoly who God is. You have so many different sects. Forget Christianity for a moment. People that actually believe in the Torah, people that actually believe in it, like non-Jewish groups, Israelites, Messianic, sacred name people. Everybody has this monopoly of like what the text is saying, but nobody really has a clear, concise view of what's being said. But I personally feel, that when you have events like Hanukkah and you have events that went on during the Second Temple period, it would only make sense that they would want some type of political figure, or military figure per se, to come and to save them. That's one image I have, not necessarily based on Isaiah 53, but just the holistic idea of Chazal, how they viewed redemption was potentially militarily and not necessarily spiritual. That's just an opinion that I have. As far as the actual text, I think you can read it both ways. I don't think you can read it either way. But I like what you said in that video, though. I didn't blame Kabbalah per se, but there is definitely some type of tweaking of meaning of words and text and ideas.
The statement or the word servant appears about 15 times from the middle of the book all the way to the end, or at least till Isaiah 53. In a few instances, it's talking about Israel. In another instance, it's talking about one person. Now, there's, I think, only two ways to read this, right, in terms of who the servant is. Someone could say it's solely Israel, or someone could say it's one individual. The notion of it being the Messiah is something the Christians ran with, even though there are many rabbis who've had that opinion. It seems that my opinion aligns a little better with the Christian opinion that it's talking about one individual, at least in Isaiah 53, one messenger of God. I call him Isaiah, they call him Jesus. Well, like I said, Israel is called the servant, but the person speaking is also called the servant. In chapter 49, it says that the servant is being sent to bring back Israel. He's even called the arm of the Lord. And we know contextually that servant, or the person sent to misguided Israel, was Isaiah. So contextually it's him speaking also. I'm not really sure where Tovia Singer, and I'm not sure if it's the Radak, all the other rabbis who say that it's speaking about Israel, but it's not that many rabbis, by the way.
No.
People think there's a consensus out there that it's speaking about Israel. Now you have Asher Meza saying one thing and he's in some way trampling on the words of the rabbis. Not at all. The problem is people think, especially people who come from Christianity and have disdain for the religion they left, they think that what Rabbi Tovia Singer teaches or what Rabbi Michael Skolbeck teaches is in some way monolithic, that everyone accepts them. And by the way, but they also think that people even know who they are. Now, I think in Messianic circles and within the circles of those who left Christianity, people know who Tovia Singer is. But in the Haredi world, in the Litvish world, no one really knows, from an academic perspective, who these guys are. Although they carry a lot of weight in the Messianic and former Messianic world. Right? So, people think that, well, you're disagreeing with Tovia Singer, you're disagreeing with the bulk of Rabbinic Judaism. It's not true at all. I'm not really sure how Gerald Siegel holds. I know that Tovia Singer built a lot of his work off the book of Gerald Siegel, and I'm not sure if you heard of Gerald Siegel, right? But Gerald Siegel
never heard of Gerald Siegel before.
So he wrote a book called The Jew and the Christian Missionary, and it predated Tovia Singer's work. Let's Get Biblical Guide. He was a teacher at Ezra Torah Academy in Queens, and he really laid the foundation for the counter-missionary movement that followed. But the reason I tied it into Kabbalah is not necessarily Lurianic Kabbalah or Kabbalah post-Zohar, but the mystical notion since the destruction of the Second Temple, that the nation intrinsically hate the Jews, that non-Jews in some way always want to destroy and kill Jews no matter what. We see this said all the time in the Jewish world. Oh, of course they hate the Jews. Oh, of course they're persecuting the Jews just because they're Jews. I mean, what does that actually mean? What they're saying is that they're persecuting the Jews because the Jews are intrinsically special, and the rodef here is intrinsically evil, like some unavoidable fact of life. And I don't think the average Jewish person has even thought about this. Mm-hmm.
They don't. You don't, because I don't think that it would fit into the narrative that people want to present. I remember when we read the curses in Vayikra, about a month ago maybe, and I remember after they finished reading them, everybody went like, they made like a noise. Everybody did it. It was like universal in the shul. I thought it was funny because they don't take it literal. They take that, wow, that's heavy, that's pretty deep, but not that could actually happen to us. When we see negative or evil happen to Jews, people who believe in Hashem, it's like these devious people are out there trying to kill us, and we don't know why.
There are many Meforshim, and even Rashi here in the Tochacha, who actually step in and say that these aren't curses, they're blessings, or the curses are actually being applied to Gentile nations. They'll actually flip the text over. But the notion of Israel suffering just stam for what they do is something that the Jewish world doesn't like to hear. Why? Because it feels good to be an underdog. It feels good to say, hey, I'm the victim. Let me just scapegoat someone else, right? But it ultimately, by definition, means that we'll never change. The Jewish community nowadays is not very self-critical. I don't see the steam in Torah, but at least not with how God himself says he'll bless us and he'll curse us. It seems like we're responsible for what happens to us. Now,
No, go ahead.
So we know Amalek and other nations have attacked us, so it's not that we just necessarily suffer for our own sins, but they would just as very much attack anyone else, right? I mean, countries attack countries, people rob other people, but to say that someone is intrinsically hell-bent on your destruction, just like an uncontrollable force in their nature to want to kill you just because you happen to be X, this is what I believe Kabbalah and mystical Judaism brought into the fold, just because, like you said, the Jewish people were suffering and they needed quick answers and they needed something to make them feel well. And this is really the birth of the Hasidic movement as well, right? In Europe, the reason the Hasidic movement took off is because it targeted Jews who were downtrodden, who felt that God had forgotten about them. So you have the Baal Shem Tov going out to them saying, no, you're intrinsically pure. You understand? The reason you're suffering, it's not because of your sins. It's not because how worthless we are, but in the contrary, how special you are. So you should sing, you should dance because you have a Jewish soul, because you have this Jewish aura within you that cannot be removed. And this is something that has lasted till today and really gave birth to the secular Jewish world. The only reason a secular Jew identifies himself with the Jewish people and not with the atheist crowd or as a Buddhist, Christian, or Muslim is because this Hasidic movement introduced this idea that no matter what you do, you're special. Not because of what you believe or how you behave, but just because of who you are, i.e. because of the blood running through your veins.
Well, the word you just mentioned, behave, how you behave. The covenant of Hashem is predicated on your behavior, actually doing something and doing actually what he says.
Right.
That you could lose your land, you could lose your life, you can lose your descendants. I mean, the various curses are put on us. But I want to ask you something. This is something that as I've been learning the last couple of months, we have this movement going on, kind of like going back to the roots, looking for the sources of practices and beliefs and these kind of things. One subject that we've talked about in the past that keeps popping up in my head is also the Sanhedrin. Not necessarily that it's the establishment, but that if you don't have a clear body of ideas, especially when going back to Isaiah 53, if no one is clear, Chazal was supposed to be our main body of literature, if they didn't tell us that this chapter is very important or this subject is very important, Why do we put so much emphasis on it? I don't know much about Midrashim, but as far as in the Gemara, the subject of this chapter is not really so big. Not having the sources and not knowing what should be and what shouldn't be, a person could easily grab a verse and run with it and create a whole theology out of it instead of having a strong body of this is what we're supposed to be doing. We're looking for some Messiah to come out of the sky to save us. That's Christians and Jews and Muslims per se. But no one's thinking, hey, we don't have the strong body that we used to. In time of Moshe Rabbeinu, they had a whole court. They had a whole structure of leaders. And after the destruction of the first temple, you kind of lost that. And then if you look at the Talmud in itself, you just have opinions. The Mishnah has that. The Gemara itself, you have opinions. And we don't have a clear say of who is the true opinion and who's not. And all of a sudden, Rashi becomes the voice of modern Judaism's interpretation of all of Tanakh. And everything Rashi says doesn't always jive with truth. It's kind of hard to say who's right and who's wrong because we don't have a sign saying who's right or who's wrong. God's not speaking to us these days. He doesn't seem the way that he was in the past. And you just have all these sources and people can just pick and choose what they want, and that's how you have these problems.
Mm-hmm. In terms of Isaiah 53 in the Christian world, it really doesn't appear in the New Testament being applied to their Messiah. I think there's one reference to one verse in it in the book of Acts or somewhere, but it's not used as a proof as much as it's used nowadays. And I think this is why it's not used, because it's ambiguous. And it's also not used, to give them credit, because the New Testament is dealing mainly during the time of Jesus, and this is a philosophy and theology that developed afterwards. This is why the Jewish world doesn't really use it that much, and there isn't a consensus on it, and everyone builds their opinion on I think there's maybe 5 Meforshim who comment on this, and I think the vast majority of them also attribute it to some Messiah. So you just said that there's some sort of movement to go back to the roots, and you tied in the idea of people establishing this new Sanhedrin. I think the desire to establish a Sanhedrin in Israel has absolutely nothing to do with going back to our roots, but rather it's just an attempt to wield power in the rabbinic world, right? Because these guys are not quoting ancient texts or modifying or removing all the customs that have crept into Israel. Now, why is it that it's so easy to create a custom, but it's almost impossible to abolish one? It's almost like taxes.
Well, that's what I mean. I don't think modern leaders, not pointing fingers at any person or any group, but I don't think modern leaders have the tools to create that Sanhedrin. It leads me to a stronger feeling that I'm not so sure I feel when I want to say outright, but the text that we have don't match the people that we have following them.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Also, I attribute a lot to Kabbalah because Kabbalah itself gets you to be more heavenly good than earthly good, right? I don't think the Jewish people care so much about results nowadays, actually physically trying to make the world a better place, because just like Christians, they're also awaiting some sort of celestial bailout. So regarding the most authentic thrust in the Jewish world for some sort of authenticity, right? The group that gets mislabeled the Rambam movement. The group is so small and really so irrelevant. I think they're famous in YouTube just for being jerks. They're probably like the cruelest people around on Facebook, just calling you names just because you happen not to pronounce something in a certain way. And they typically also adhere to the Noahide movement. As a matter of fact, I think they're the biggest peddlers of the Noahide movement, just because they also fail to understand why the Rambam even mentioned it in the first place, i.e., not to give Gentiles an alternative to Judaism, but just to codify laws that for some reason people overlooked in other codifications, mainly because it didn't apply to them in their age, right? The notion of Eger Toshav, etc. I think in terms of progressing, the Jewish people currently are going backwards. I honestly hope that a Sanhedrin does not get full generation, and temple is not physically built in our generation either. Because the question is, who's going to lead that Sanhedrin, and who's going to run the temple? Can you really imagine Hasidei Malachim or Satmar or Chabad running the temple in the Sanhedrin? Right?
That's my point, that we've gone so far from, it's not about clothes and dress. It's far more important, not about how we pronounce words, but again, these people that you're mentioning, they have roots that date back only 400, 500 years, and they read books that are only 400, 500 years. I dive in right now in the Sephardic Minyan on Shabbat, and there's many people in this Minyan who they come from different Middle Eastern countries, whatever, but they're holding a Mishnah Berurah, and it's funny to see it. Like, you say you're Sephardic, but you're holding a book that was written by a European rabbi in the 1920s.
I don't know the difference. That's the biggest problem.
But he was writing the book for people of his generation in his enclave of thought. Again, it's not about to say going back to sources, but it is sources. It's going back to what does God want from the Torah itself? And if Chazal are the ones we're supposed to be following in their opinions, what are their opinions? It's very difficult to weed through all of there's literally genres of Jewish thought. I'm a Lifak. I'm a Chassid. I'm a Karlabach. Well, Rabbi Nachman says this. Rabbi Nachman says that. Well, Bob Shirley says this. And you have a lot of emphasized spiritual concepts. For example, taking it something personal in my own life right now. My mother passed away, and everyone's saying, "Oh, she's here with you." Like, who said that? Who said that someone who passes away is still on this earth somewhere in the spirit realm? Those are things that we can't necessarily define because we're not in the spirit world. We're in the physical world. Hashem gave man power over the physical existence of the world as far as holding down laws. If I'm saying it right, Deuteronomy 17, about blood and blood, legion and legion are, what's kosher, what's not kosher, basically, not about angels and demons. And you've said it over last summer, like most people who read Tanakh read it in Christianized. And most of them read it as if it's actually something's going to happen in the near future or down the line, not taking into consideration that Isaiah lived in his time period, and he was probably prophesying people in his time period. And you also said recently in the last video that there are more prophets than the ones we know of. So we can't take 12, maybe 16 prophets. We can't take those 16 and say that's the only thing God said about these subjects and run with it that way. These are only godly men that we have in the world, and it's the only thing that's been said about God that can be written and be trusted.
Right. And most of those books are written by the men of the Great Assembly. No one authorized them to write these books. I think that they were just compiling and writing these books to give us a historical account of the life and times of those prophets. In the time of the Maccabees, they outlawed the study of Torah, so people would study these books instead. And this is when all the offshoots in Judaism began, because people started building doctrines off the hyperbole found in prophets and completely overlooking the Torah, which they weren't allowed to study. But this is why I think that you can abolish any offshoot by going straight to the source, by going straight to Torah. But for some reason, people consider Torah a secondary book, right? And in some way are waiting for every letter of the prophets to be fulfilled. That we shouldn't hang off every word of the prophet. There's a lot of hyperbole there. Honestly, there's probably a lot of mistakes in there also, because halakha instructs us on how to write a Sefer Torah. It does not instruct us on how to write the other books that we find in Tanakh. Right? In other words, the way you write a Sefer Torah is by copying another Sefer Torah. Why? To secure its authenticity. The books of the prophets could have been written straight from memory, and we see that the prophets that we have, the books of the prophets we have in the Dead Sea Scrolls, don't align exactly with the ones we have nowadays in the Masoretic text. Why? Because it was never meant to be lumped in together with the Torah. Right? But I have no problem with Sephardim studying Mishnah Berurah as long as they know the difference. The problem is that they don't know the difference, and I blame the rabbis for this, because rabbis are too lazy to explain to their congregation, this is halakha, this is med, this is agadah.
Right.
Because they're lazy, they'll just say, consider it as if it was all giving to Moses on Mount Sinai. Consider it all Torah Sheba'al Peh, which is really a way to canonize their own power, because there's many rabbis who even say that the words of the late great Rabbi Ovadia Yosef, everything he said is also considered Torah Sheba'al Peh and was also given on Mount Sinai, i.e., everything he's telling you now was also given to you on Mount Sinai. In other words, you must obey. I think that this is why Judaism is a religion that its practitioners know the least of how their religion actually functions. They really thought a little about what they do and why they do it. They'll realize that I would say around 80% of what they call Judaism nowadays is all fluff.
That's a
But
hard pill to swallow. That's a really hard pill
yeah,
to swallow, to take into consideration that everything we've been taught is pretty much opinion, and that
right.
really you only have so much that's actually applicable and actually like you have to believe in it. Quote a lot of times the Book of Tehillim as a source of something. In reality, it's not really a source for anything. If it's not in the Torah itself, then again, the word Torah again is like, again, the word Torah, the way it's defined is Torah is the Babich Rebbe or it's a Sefer in Musar somewhere. That's Torah. As much
Right,
as
they'll say Torah says, and they'll quote Likutei Moran or the Tanya.
you can have no problem with those books, those people, but it's a misguided opinion on some. It's unfortunate, and again, I think it's because the people that we have believing in the Torah are so disconnected from what was actually said thousands of years ago. It's just you have a history and you have people that come up out of the woodworks, and history is developed. It's made. You have organizations that had a manifesto when it first started, and now you have what it is today, and it's like, well, Democrats hundreds of years ago were not the ones you have today. As far as Republicans and vice versa, I mean, things change and switch around, but the Torah is not supposed to change. Yet it has changed drastically, and now you have every Tom, Dick, and Harry saying that they know Torah, that there is some kind of teacher or rabbi, chacham, moreh, whatever you want to have it. I mean, you go on YouTube and you'll find everybody on there saying they have the truth and that, this person's not really Jewish, that person's not Jewish, this person's not a believer, we're the real ones, and that's not really healthy when it comes to actually building up anything with truth. I don't think that God's covenant was to be closed off to just certain people. I think God picked a certain people, and then whoever wants to attach themselves to that people could do it. But now you have, it's like almost a club. If you don't fit into my way of doing it, you're wrong. And for the most part, I think the Torah's commandments are pretty self-explanatory. I don't think they're very hard to decipher. I think the end-all be-all is that as long as we live in a mindset that the land of Israel is up for grabs and that it's just sitting there, and as long as we're living in a world where a person can live and die in Kiryas Yol and never leave out of it, and never consider the idea that most of the mitzvot that we're supposed to be keeping are supposed to be done in Israel, you also have a big problem. That as long as the Torah is a religion and not a way of life, meaning it's not a life that is lived the way it's supposed to be lived, however that's supposed to be, not defining anything per se, but as long as it's being done in a sense where I can keep all my old customs from my countries, I'm Moroccan, I'm Ashkenaz, and that's fine. There's going to be a lot of confusion because we're not holding to what is supposed to be. We're holding on to what we're told from our exiled countries.
Right.
It's harder for converts who convert and say someone wants to become Yemenite because Yemenite seems to be the oldest looking tradition of Judaism, and they can't because Yemenite isn't popular. They have to put on a black hat. They have to put on a white shirt. They can't say things a certain way. Everyone's pulling and tugging to fit into boxes where the Torah is not a box. It's a way. It is what it is. It's very self-explanatory.
I don't have a problem with people bringing in their cultures from where they're at and how they grew up, as long as they're not intolerant to other opinions. I mean, it seems that before Rashi, before the Rambam, before we had some sort of consensus of what we thought halakha was, people were free to just go straight to the Mishnah, straight to the Gemara, and paskin by however they saw fit. But the difference was they weren't criticizing others who may have held by an unpopular opinion. I think the understanding is that what makes a heretic is someone who paskins outside of Chazal. That once you had a codification, like for example the Rambam or the Rif, to get Sephardim pointing their fingers at anyone else who had a different postic, like in Europe with Rabbi Hananel, one of the first European poskim. Instead of saying like, you know what, Elu ve'elu divrei Elokim chaim, that we could all coexist halachically if we just stick to this one text. And this is really the problem I have today. I don't have a problem with people going by the Mishnah Berurah, like going by the Ben Ish Chai. The problem I have is people in some way pointing their fingers saying, you're wrong, or you're a weirdo, or we paskin like this, and if you don't paskin by the Shulchan Aruch, you're outside of the fold. That's the problem. I don't think that we should in some way lumping all the customs into one, into some sort of Israeli custom, even though...
Neither do I. No, I'm not saying that. But I'm saying a person is going to read a book. If we're all pointing fingers at who's right and who's wrong, it's hard when we're using these books that are geared towards a certain community. You know what I'm saying? I don't think the Quran was writing Mishnah Berurah for it to be a universal text for all Ashkenazim. I think he was using it as more of a gloss of the time period that he lived in and the community that he lived in, meaning in Eastern Europe. I don't think he was using it for someone who lives in America. Our streets are completely different. You know, without getting into the debate of the subject of the Eruv, you can't use text from one particular area and hold that for everybody across the globe. That doesn't work that way. But when you have subject matters that are pretty much universal and flat across the board, you can use a text. But using a text that doesn't fit into the geographical and just our modern world, it's very difficult to put it into like a box. It's very difficult. So using these books, if you're Sephardic and saying that I have to tuck in my tzitzit because it's a custom that based upon the Arizal, that's a hard one to null over when you had Jews for who knows how long wearing them in various ways, or you have the minhag to not eating a sukkah because of this, if you hold by a shita. A shita is one thing, but if you have an actual commandment that's supposed to be done a certain way, then it's done away with because some rabbi in this area says it based upon that book. That's what I'm saying, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Yeah. But again, no problem with people holding certain ways as long as they're open to saying, you know what, we could all possibly be right in this area, but there's a disconnect because people don't learn from source material anymore, or like you said, where they go through compilations. Now, in terms of the Mishnah Berurah and the works of the Chavetz, or what some would say the students of the Chavetz, I think that by that time the Ashkenazi world was already poskening for Jewry as a whole in their mindset, right? I mean, the Mishnah Berurah is probably less than 100 years old. And even up to the time of the Shulchan Aruch, where these individuals thought that this is how Judaism held. Now, this idea didn't really exist after the time of the Geonim. I mean, even though the Geonim had two yeshivot, I mean, there were basically two opinions whether you could hold by. And at that time, you were also free, like I said, to poskin for yourself. I mean, to poskin your own shilas. In terms of how we're going to progress, I think that we should stick to source material. And I think for those who are new to the religion, and I consider myself an amateur, but we should start with the Rambam's Mishnah Torah just because it's not only the first, but the only complete codification of Jewish law. And I think one rule when I'm trying to understand Jewish literature or halakhic ideas is that if it doesn't appear in the Rambam, most likely it was made up by a later generation. Not always, but most likely.
Most part.
Right. So in terms of getting back to the source, I recommend people going straight to the Rambam. Now, once you're a gadol, you can go right into the Mishnah. Well, not really, I mean, a gadol in the way it's understood nowadays as having some sort of Das Torah or something. But once you know a little more, hop into the Mishnah, hop into the Gemara. And just be tolerant of other people. Now, there's a lot, I think, that for many, it feels good to exclude, right? And it's not a bad thing to exclude if you're using fair scales. And you know what? There's a lot to exclude, even if you went by the Gemara alone. Even though there are a handful of opinions on how to do a certain act in different ways, it's still, I mean, going by the Mishnah doesn't mean that you're completely so open-minded that your brains are going to fall out.
Right.
Although I see the backlash with groups like YCT, Open Orthodoxy, or people who say, you know what, I'm going to ordain female rabbis just because halakha doesn't require rabbis to only be males. But the notion of the rabbi doesn't even appear in halakha, right? I mean, of course, the members of the Sanhedrin had to be males. But another example, if some open-minded community wanted to remove the mechitza, right? There's no halakha that says you need an actual mechitza to pray. So
that's when you're breaking traditions, which are more holy than the laws themselves.
Right, but these are
as if you see a woman praying, you're going to have lewd thoughts about her. It means something wrong with you more than her. If you're looking at a woman praying to God while you're praying to God and have lewd thoughts, it's a problem.
Right. But this is something that was developed later on. Now, I'm all for the separations between men and women when they pray, but I'm not for saying that it's usher. Ideally, like if there was an Orthodox synagogue, and there is actually one Orthodox synagogue that I used to attend, but I attended there with the minyan they had that actually had a machitza. There's an Orthodox synagogue in Denver called BMH that is the only Orthodox synagogue that the main sanctuary doesn't have a machitza. Now they have a smaller sanctuary called, I believe, Shari Simcha or something like that, that does have a mechitza, so that's how it could coexist as a synagogue belonging to the OU organization of synagogues. But to say that it's usher to walk in there, right, like from a halachic perspective, just because the idea was developed later on, I think this is what we're fighting against. Where they're trying to keep people dumb by just being able to parrot what later Achronim say what's usher and what's not usher. Instead of saying, like, people don't care what does the Mishnah say, what's the opinion of the Sanhedrin, when they care what rabbi on YouTube with a long beard said I can't do it, right? And if you challenge them, they're like, oh, well, I mean, it's like challenging, I was like talking about someone's mom. Do you think you know more than my rabbi? So that's the stupidity that we're fighting against.
Well, this is the world of religion in the 21st century.
Right. And I think this is why people dislike me a lot. Oh, Ashmez is not only not a rabbi, he's not a Jew. I mean,
you're obnoxious. You're obnoxious.
Yeah, I mean, but the idea
pun intended.
Right. I like for some reason I think people who make these accusations haven't really
spent
a lot of time.
Whether you're right or wrong, the fact that you have somebody like yourself who's out there not arguing but presenting these situations, these cases. Thank God for people like you. I've always said, thank God for people like you.
Right.
People who out there just take things and sit in their pew and just take it. They're sheep. If you see your rabbi using a pasuk out of line to justify racism or something like that in your shul on Shabbos, you have every right to say no. This is not right. And how much more? How much more so? Someone using a pasuk out of line to deviate from what you obviously see as the saying in the pasuk, yet you totally wash over it and say no, it's saying this. I mean, we have to be. I think the whole idea of Limud Torah was to be open-minded, to be able to go through sources and to figure things out for yourself, not to just be a puppet. You find rabbis all over the Gemara disagreeing, seeing things differently, and all of a sudden you have a way of doing things that seems to be completely opposite from everybody else, but then you're a heretic. Rabbi Yossi was not a heretic of the Galil for, eating Bosel V'Cholos. He wasn't a heretic. It was okay for him to do it, and he did it. This community did it. They weren't heretics. But let someone, eat a chicken sandwich with a little bit of cheese on it, they're going to call him a heretic. Or if you put a cheese dish next to a flesh dish on your table, you're a heretic. Don't have red scrubbies and blue scrubbies in your kitchen. You're not from. It's knowing sources and knowing what God requires of you and knowing what true halakha just requires of you instead of just the custom of what halakha is presumed to be. How you assume is the interpretation of what a verse says, going back to Isaiah 3, or any other verse where you can use it, assuming it to be something. Shutting the mouths of the people. People used to always allow Judaism, when I first got into it, that you could ask questions in Judaism. That's not true. That's true. You can't ask questions in Judaism. If you do,
that's true. You cannot ask questions. It's true.
You can ask questions.
You can ask, okay. To give them the benefit of that, you could ask questions. However, you cannot reject their response or their answer. Right? I mean, you could ask, why do we do this? And they're like, oh, well, because, like my Rebbe said so. Fine. Next question. Right? So that's something that I think that people who try to romanticize Talmud learning, it's a statement they make out of ignorance. And this whole notion about who is and who is not a rabbi, I think people have romanticized this notion of a rabbi, that they're the spiritual giants. Anyone who's learned in yeshiva knows that only because you got smicha. I mean, nowadays it's smicha in 6 months probably, in Esther Veheter, in something very easy. I mean, these guys don't know anything, right? I mean, it's not I mean, something, because I hear people attacking Rabbi Mizrahi, this and that, just because he may have got smicha. I mean, like most Sephardi rabbis, I mean, they get smicha from private individuals and not big organizations, which is something that I think first occurred with the reform movement in Hebrew Union College, and in some way think that's the only standard. If you're not getting smicha from Ner Yisrael or Yeshiva University, it's not real smicha. I mean, mind you, I have two smichas and people still call me an imposter, this and that. Anyone can get smicha if you know other rabbis like who admire you and who test you, and it's not impossible. But I think the easiest way to discredit someone in the rabbinical world who has a title rabbi, because mind you, in Israel, the title rabbi doesn't mean anything, right? I mean, with the average yeshiva guy there who learns all day, doesn't even care about getting smicha. Like, he could know Shas in and out, and he only gets smicha like if he's moving to America, because he's got to get a job. In America, it's like smicha. You know, so, of course, when I moved back from Israel, I said, if like, a Chabad rabbi across the street would like to be called rabbi, you know, so then call me rabbi also because I have smicha. They're like, oh, well, your beard's not long, and of course you hold a little differently than everyone else. People would really be surprised on how many Israeli Jews hold almost identical to how I hold, even with converts. I mean, I've spoken to Israelis that I mentioned that I have an organization that encourages non-Jews to become Jewish, and they're like, that's a great idea, right? I mean, it seems like you have to be in Galut to disagree. Right, and also there's tons of Israeli Jews who also don't hold by the Zohar, and I think a lot of the hatred towards me is also that I'm a convert, and they're thinking like, who is this guy? You know, I mean, you're not even born Jewish, trying to tell us, you know. And mind you, like my biggest haters are converts themselves. I mean, they're the worst because they're the ones trying to outdo.
Well, again, I think it's that you have
the born Jew
and not uniformity.
Trying to
not saying uniformity in the sense of we're all one people who have to do everything the same. But I think the fact that everything is so up in the air, that you don't have, it's almost as if, you know, we're in a room with a bunch of books we can't read. And we can pinpoint a couple of words that we know, and then we put things together and we match it up. And then, you know, we all go to our own cities and then we make up our own things out of it, what we assume we read or learned. That's a very bad muscle, but I don't think that we have it together. I don't think that we know what we're doing, where we're going, I should say. And, you know, I read it this way, you read it that way. You're a liar. You're not true. And you're right. You're a convert. Who do you think you are? When I go places to this day, I've been Jewish pretty well a long time now. And they'll say things to me in Hebrew, then say it in English. And they'll say, do you know what I'm talking about? You know, I think I can handle myself now. You know, I don't think you have to translate things for me still. It's an assumption that converts are stupid. And then you have that one person, oh, he's a Chacham, he's a Ger Tzedek, and he's a Chacham. And then you speak to him, and then he is a parrot of what he learned in yeshiva. So I don't think that it's necessarily hate against you. I think that it's ignorance. Using Plato's allegory of the cave, you put people into a cave and you tell them that this is reality, and then someone comes and tells them something different. You know, they're going to try and kill you. And that's just the reality of life. That's been reality forever. They tried to kill emotion 1,000 times over, you know. This is what it is. And when you have long-bearded individuals who run the world, run the Jewish world, that's what you get. You know, no one can do conversions. No one can marry you off. No one can tell you that you can't do this and you can't do this, or you can do this. Because really, it's a lot of you can't do, really, when you can do it. And here's a source to tell you that you can do it, but you're not going to go against this source because this source has been used 1,000,000 times over to tell you you can't. When in reality, that's not the way it works all the time. You know, but I gotta go. It's Shabbat, and I got some things to do.
Good stuff, man.